Our questions today come from Exodus chapter 26. Exodus chapter 26. Big chapter on the instructions for the tabernacle. And as you know, God's going to make His presence in the tabernacle. This is going to be the place for the Day of Atonement and the sacrifices and all of that. And so a big, huge part of the Israelite history and the beginning days of worship to God being able to manifest His presence in the tabernacle there. And so as He begins to lay all that out, Exodus 26 is a lot about how all this is going to come together, and you put the rings on one end and put poles through it, and it had a certain way it all folded up. It's really kind of interesting if you look at all of it and see how God planned it. He wanted them to make some curtains, which was kind of the walls. And He wanted them to make the curtains out of what animal hair? Goat hair. Goat hair. So the curtains, the walls, as it were, around the tabernacle, and as you read Exodus 26, these were carefully planned out and sized, and they you've seen different things like a I don't know, a jack-in-the-box or something maybe more elaborate than that, and everything kind of folds up in itself, right, and goes in the box. Well, that's what these curtains would serve as. It would all fold up together, and it would be traveled or be hauled in certain manner and all of that. And so these curtains were made out of goat hair. We've already been told a lot about the furniture, if you will, inside the tabernacle. Things like the lampstand and the table of showbread, the Ark of the Covenant, and different things. Well, they were to be overlaid with pure gold, but they were to be made out of wood. But a certain kind of wood. What was it? Acacia wood. They just did, every one of them in here knew it. They just wasn't sure they were going to pronounce it right, and they didn't want to be embarrassed, okay? So I get it. If you're like Callan, for some reason, acacia sounds like Russian, and so it's been Russian wood all day for us. I don't know. But anyway, it was not Russian wood. It was acacia wood that I understand to be some kind of gnarly, thorny, kind of gum-like tree. What I really understand about it is that insects would not bore in it. And so that was pretty key. Of course, I'm thinking if you're going to overlay it with gold, what difference does it really make? But maybe it does some. Obviously, them being out in the wilderness and traveling, and of course, there would be a lot of insects. And so my understanding is that this particular wood would not attract insects as much as other woods might. And so that's perhaps why God told them to make it out of that particular wood. It was also very plenteous, I understand, in the Sinai Peninsula at that time. And so that would be another reason why they would use that wood as well. In the tabernacle, there was the veil. And the veil was nothing more than a large curtain that would hang. And of course, that veil would be torn at the cross from the top down, right? But until it was torn, when Jesus died on the cross, it separated what? The holy place from the most holy place, right? And so this veil would be hung, and behind the veil, if you will, out in front of it, the holy place would be things like the lampstand and the table of showbread, and many were allowed inside that area. But then you'd have the veil, right? And beyond the veil, in the most holy place, would be the Ark of the Covenant. On top of it, the mercy seat. And of course, that's where the high priest would go only once a year. And so obviously we see the importance of the veil being torn at the cross from top to bottom, and thus opening up the most holy place so that you and I can be high priest and go into the most holy place anytime, all the time, every time, unlike the Old Testament system where it was only once a year there with the most holy place. And so there's Exodus chapter 26. As I mentioned this morning, on Sunday evenings together, at least the ones that I'm speaking that are not youth night and other special things along the way this year, we are going to, if you take the word of parable, it's a compound word. It comes from the words para and the word balo. Okay, so let's break this down. Y'all do a little Greek? So para, all right, P-A-R-A. You ever talked about the parameter of something? Well, that's all the way around, right? That's the parameter, right? So that's where the word comes from, para. It means to go around or to be alongside of or to encompass. The word balo, well, what would you do with a ball, you think? Well, you could do a lot of things with a ball, but you would throw a ball, right? So the word balo means to throw. So what the word parable means is to go around, throwing around and alongside of. Obviously, if you were here this morning, you know that we are trying to encompass a spiritual truth by putting it alongside of or throwing it together with a practical, everyday, common illustration. And so as we dig deeper on Sunday evenings to try to understand the meaning of parables. If you read the family news this morning, you saw where I told you really the only parable that is given extensive explanation is the parable of the sower. And we're going to talk about it first, and it'll be kind of easy on Sunday night because Jesus kind of lays out, here's what this is and here's what it means. But most of the time he does not do that. And so what we'll be doing on Sunday evenings is we'll either be looking at the parallel passage to Sunday morning, which we're going to do tonight. If you have your Bibles, we want to be opening them to Matthew chapter 13. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 13 at the parallel passage to Luke chapter 8 that we studied from this morning. On other occasions on Sunday evenings this year, we will be digging deeper into a interpretation or an application of that particular parable from the morning. And so, like, the gist of the parable might be humility. And so on Sunday night, we are going to carve out humility and what that means and what that looks like and how you and I can improve in our humility. If the message of the parable is greed, then we may dig in to greed. If the message of the parable is priorities, then we may dig into priorities on Sunday night. Or it might just be that we flip over and say, okay, here's a parallel passage. Now let's look at what it tells us that the passage this morning did not tell us. So several things that we could do with this. Tonight we look at Matthew 13. Matthew 13 is a rather lengthy parallel to that of Luke chapter 8. Where Jesus basically was asked the question in Luke 8 or Matthew 13, why do you teach in parables? Why do you use parables? And as I said this morning, there is a desire here to separate honest hearts from dishonest hearts. Now, I don't want to repeat everything on Sunday night that we say on Sunday morning, but I do want you to give me the privilege to illustrate some things, maybe use some different words, but to maybe go over again some of the focus of the Sunday morning lesson. And certainly that was a point this morning, that there are two groups, the honest hearts and the dishonest hearts. Those that would receive the mysteries or the secrets and those that would not. Those honest hearts that would accept the truth of the parable. And you know what's interesting? And so here's what I'm going to do this year because I've given myself permission to do it. I'm going to talk to the Sunday night crowd, okay? Now, if the Sunday morning crowd gets offended, then guess what? You told them, because I'm not. I'm going to talk to the Sunday night crowd, okay? So I'm going to talk to you like you're a Sunday night crowd, because that's what you are. So I'm going to talk to you like you're honest-hearted people. I'm making that assumption. So what do we mean by honest-hearted people? Well, here's what happens sometimes. You think about this now and tell me if this is not true. Sometimes you remember the parable better than you remember the truth that is taught by the parable. That's just honesty, right? And it's just an honest heart saying, because what would happen is these people who are honest-hearted people would open up fully to what Jesus was saying. And it would make so much common dirt sense to them, right? That it would even sometimes overshadow, if you will, the truth that was being taught. And so you'd ask them, okay, well, what was the parable? Well, man, they could tell you the parable and every detail of the parable, though they might forget sometimes what the truth that lies within the parable would be. That's an honest-hearted person. The contrast to that is those dishonest hearts. Well, they would close up and never receive any of it. So not only would they not get it, they wouldn't seek to understand it, and therefore they wouldn't remember it. And so as we covered this morning in verse 11 there of Matthew chapter 13, as we covered from Luke chapter 8, to you it has been given to know the secrets. Now I listed 4 questions on the front of the Family News, and I'm not suggesting that we'll answer all of them, and I'm not suggesting that that's all the questions that could be asked. But one of those questions there, and I'll mention them every now and then, one of those questions is it okay for God to keep a secret? And if you're here this morning, you understand that this is not really a mystery, right? This is not really a secret. God's not keeping anything. Now let's answer the question, is it okay for God to have secrets? Absolutely. God can do anything He wants to do, okay? So if God wants to hide something, and if God wants to be mysterious with something, then that's His prerogative to do just how He wants to do, and you and I, we just have to accept it, right? So when He's telling the message in the prophets of the mystery of the gospel and the mystery of Jesus Christ, a message that is going to be revealed eventually, that's God's prerogative. He didn't do anything wrong in the prophets. He was trying to prepare those people in a code language, if you will, with a very important message. Now, they could either choose to listen to the message and try to understand what the message was, or they could refuse and therefore miss the Messiah. And unfortunately, a lot of them did. Same way in the book of Revelation. If God wants to use the Holy Spirit to inspire a writing that is in literature such that it is encoded, then that's God's prerogative. And what you and I don't need to do is we don't need to go to that book and think that it all applies to us and think that we can understand every symbol, because we cannot. But they could. There wasn't any secrets to the first century Christians. They got it clearly, what John was trying to reveal to them through the revelation of Jesus Christ in the book of Revelation. And so while you and I look at it, and maybe we could accuse God of keeping some secrets or some mysteries, really that doesn't hold water, because God's not, He could if He wanted to, but the reality of it is that different contexts require different approaches. And Jesus realized that the best approach with these multitudes of people was parables. And there would be people who would take the parable and they would go all the way around it, and they would throw it up and back down. And they would throw it again until they got it. And then there would be people that would say, you know what? I ain't going to waste my time on that. I'm not going to walk all the way around that parameter, and I'm not going to throw it around and try to figure it out. Thus, distinguishing between the two groups. In verse 12, we find something very interesting here, and some questions that come from this passage concerning why the use of parables. Jesus says in verse 12, "For the one who has, more will be given, and he will have in an abundance. And the one who has not, even what he has, will be taken away." And we just look at that, and of course we probably start thinking about material things, and I don't think it has anything to do with material things. I think that's a total misapplication of that verse entirely. It's not applicable in the context. It's not even applicable in the background of the teaching of what's going on here in any way, shape, form, or fashion. We're not talking about the one who has a lot of material blessings the Lord's going to give more to, and the one that don't have any, that he's going to take away what they have. Doesn't have anything to do with material blessings at all. You remember what happened in the parable of the talents? Do you remember where the one talent went to? I think that illustrates what's said, by the way, in Matthew 13 and verse 12. To the one who has, he will be given more in abundance. So the 5-talent man had 10 talents, and he received the 1 talent from the third man. To the one who has not, even what he has will be taken. The one man, the 1-talent man, got his talent taken away from him. He had little. He had very little in comparison to the 2-talent man and to the 4-talent man. When they started, he had very little. When the master came, he had even less because he hadn't done anything with it in comparison to what they had. And what he had was taken away from him. Now think about it just really practical for me for just a moment. I got it at my house to prove it. I went and looked at it this afternoon. This old boy right here, are you listening? This old boy right here won the Algebra 1 award in high school. I needed you to know that, okay? And I went and looked at it today because I needed to know that, right? It was just Algebra 1, but it was algebra, okay? I couldn't do algebra to save my life today. And I loved math at one time. I loved to do math. But you know as well as I do that I've blundered more times with math than any other subject, perhaps than English, right? And I brutal it all the time. My point is, I ain't using it, all right? I had it. I could do it. If I sat down and gave myself some time and application, I could do it again. If I had continued to work on math like my math teacher here since I was in Algebra 1, I would be able to do it better and more proficient today than I could have in the 9th grade, right? But I hadn't. I hadn't kept up with it. So what ability I had has left me. It's been taken because I didn't use the ability. That's just a practical way to illustrate Matthew 13 and verse 12. If you don't use it, you will lose it. And that applies to everything physically speaking, but it also applies to everything spiritually speaking. If you're not striving to grow and be stronger in the Lord, you will lose the very ground you're standing on and go backwards. There's no such thing as being idle spiritually. Because if you're idle, you're like I was yesterday on that hillside. You're sliding backwards, right? You think you're idle, but in reality you're going backwards. If you don't use it, you'll lose it. So if you're not striving to grow in it, and then here's the other side of that in a positive way. That's the negative. The positive way is if you use it, you'll become more proficient at it. And so if we're growing spiritually, and if we're seeking to make application to our lives, I'm talking to honest hearts here, right? People who want to do right, who want to do better, who want to be more like Jesus, then the more we strive at that, the better we'll become at that. And that illustrates Matthew 13 And verse 12, for the one who has, maybe we could put in parentheses, I realize it's not in the text, but maybe we could put in parentheses, for the one who has the desire, more will be given. So the heart that is willing to open up and receive the teaching and meditate upon the teaching and alter behaviors and lives and grow in it, more will even be given. And the ability and the challenges of life will even become greater, and we can grow to even higher heights as we continue this journey. This is why I speak in parables, verse 13. And here's Luke 8 and verse 10. Because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. Now, we went through all of that this morning. The question that we could ask is, so is God somehow veiling the message in that they don't have the ability to get it? And if you were here this morning, you already know the answer to that. How could God be fair and be just and yet create a situation to where somebody does not have the ability to comprehend it? For example, terrible illustration, but it's the best one I've got. There's not a person in this room tonight that believes that if a person is born with Down syndrome and they live to whatever age they live to with that terrible illness, that they are accountable to God on Judgment Day. You don't believe that. Not a one of you believe that. Now, how could they be accountable to God if they were inflicted with that disease, none of their own doing, you see? How could God be fair and just in that? In the same way, how could God be fair and just to create a situation where somebody doesn't have the ability to comprehend the teaching of the parable? In other words, they see it, but they don't see it. And the reason why they don't see it is because God has somehow, in His infinite being, limited their ability. I can't conjure up a situation where that is even possible. No, God is not limiting the ability of mankind. Mankind is limiting his own ability by his choice to accept or refuse. And in so refusing, in sin and rebellion, then his ability or her ability to comprehend is therefore limited. Thus why I have said all along, and I don't know that you and I comprehend this to the depth of it, and I'm still trying to get it greater in my mind, how I'm convinced tonight that you and I have the power to limit the Creator. Now you think about that for just a moment. The one who spoke everything into existence, and yet you and I have the power to limit Him based on our choices. Based on our desire to accept or refuse. Can God save every soul that's ever lived? Absolutely. 100%. Without a doubt, He could save every soul. Will He be able to? No. And the answer is not because He's not able. The answer is because some won't let Him. And in the same way, these people, the dishonest-hearted people, the other category that we talked about this morning, that though they see, they do not see, and though they hear, they do not hear, and they don't understand, have ultimately limited God because they chose to put up a curtain and not receive the message. Therefore, Jesus says, and Matthew quotes Isaiah chapter 6 and verses 9 and 10. And Matthew gives the full quote, for indeed they hear, but they will never understand, and they see, but they will never perceive. And I mentioned this morning that Luke just gives us kind of an excerpt from it. For in verse 15, their hearts have grown dull. Literally, the word there means fat. Their hearts have grown fat. You ever seen somebody try to live with a fat heart? Well, we don't call it that, nurses, I understand. It's called an enlarged heart. Excuse me. It's a fat heart. That's what it is. And it's hard to live with a fat heart. Physically, it's hard to live. How are you going to try it spiritually? Their heart has fattened. It's grown dull. It's insensitive. And the ability to thrive in that spiritually is impossible. Their ears, they can't hear. Their eyes, they've closed them. If they would open their eyes, they could see. If they would open their ears, they could hear. If they would open their heart, they could understand. They would need to turn. And if they would do that, I would heal them. Now this comes out of Isaiah 6, where God is commissioning Isaiah to go preach to this people. And his desire, look at God's desire for the Israelite people. I wish that they would turn and be healed. Don't tell me God doesn't desire to save everyone. Even a stubborn, rebellious nation like Israel, playing the harlot with all these idols and all these other small g gods of all these other nations. Even God admitting to the status of their heart and their eyes and their ears. He says, if they just open them, if they just open them, and they would turn back to me, I would heal them. It's unfortunate that sin and rebellion causes us to be blinded, causes us to be in a position where we can't hear and where we can't understand. But don't ever lose sight of the fact, and this is another one of them things I just can't wrap my mind around, that on Judgment Day, God is going to say to some souls, plural, "Depart from me, I never knew you." And the longest walk that anyone has ever taken to a devil's hell, and the whole time they're walking, he's going to be wishing he could have offered, they would have accepted the offer of the salvation that he had. Be too late then. It'll be over then. You know that. I know that. But I can't believe for a moment that it will change the desire of God as he watches that soul walk away. He'd be thinking in his mind, if only they would have turned. If only they would have opened their eyes, their ears, and their heart, I could have healed them spiritually. You see, the problem's rebellion. That was the problem in Isaiah's day. It was the problem in Jesus' day. It's the problem today. It's rebellion. It's refusing to do what we know is right. But there's a contrast here in verse 16. But blessed are your eyes. I told you we got two groups here. He talks to the first group, and then he talks about the second group, and now he's come back to the first group. Blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For truly I say to you, verse 17, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see and did not, and to hear what you hear and did not. To which I ask this question. Are you and I tonight in a position of advantage over the prophets and righteous people of long ago? I don't answer too many questions, but I think I'll answer this one. I think the answer is yes. That we are, in fact, at an advantage. Because of all that we have and are able to see. The prophets are writing about, and I'm not trying to minimize their education or intellect or any of that, but they are writing about something they'll die hundreds of years before it ever comes to be. I'm not saying they doubt it. I'm just simply saying they stand on the other side of it. Many righteous people have longed to look into the mystery. And now Jesus says in Matthew 13 and verse 17, I even think he's talking to the disciples that ask him the question. You are at an advantage over the prophets and righteous people of old. Like Abraham, Moses, those guys. And then if I fast forward to where I stand today, I am at an advantage over the disciples of Matthew 13. So ultimately, I feel doubly advantaged over the prophets and the righteous people of long ago. Now, with that advantage then comes responsibility, doesn't it? With that advantage comes accountability, doesn't it? I'm not saying we're any better or any more important or any more valuable to God. Don't read into what I'm saying here to mean something that I don't mean. I simply mean that you and I are living in a time and in a society and in a culture where we have so many advantages in comparison to these people. And the prophets longed to look and to be able to see, but they weren't able. And it wasn't their fault that they weren't able. They just lived at the wrong time. You and I, as those that are living now, I'll just summarize it by saying this. We don't have no excuse. Because we've got it all right here at our fingertips. It's all plain to see and easy to understand. There is no excuse for us. We can't claim ignorance. We can't claim the fact that the story's not yet been fully told. We can't claim that, well, we were waiting on something. And if it had come while we were alive, then that's not the case. The only thing we're waiting on, if anything, is the second coming. And all that's going to do is change our physical state to a spiritual, eternal, immortal state. So we have an advantage. Yeah. And I think we're going to be held accountable on Judgment Day for that advantage. God help us to understand the time in which we live. And whatever it takes to give the effort to go all the way around and alongside of to these messages that are thrown together and alongside one another of what it is that is spiritual in nature that God is trying to teach. I'm begging you to dig deep into the Scriptures. To dig deep into the gospel. You've got a great advantage. Don't take it for granted. The prophets would have longed to have held a Bible in their hand. They didn't get the chance. You do, and so do I. The disciples of Matthew 13 would have, could you imagine what they could have done? Imagine this. Imagine the Apostle Paul and Eastern European missions teaming up to pass out Bibles. I mean, just imagine that for a moment. Paul didn't have that luxury, right? He didn't have the printed word. As a matter of fact, he was writing a good bit of it, wasn't he? Through inspiration. You and I have it. Don't take it for granted. And whatever you do, don't rebel against it and close your eyes and your ears to it. The desire needs to be there, and if the desire's there, you will be given an extra measure of desire to even grow greater. What a blessing that'll be to understand the Word of God even greater, even deeper as we study and as we stay in it. Hope you'll stay with me this year. Some of the parables are going to be real fun. And we're going to try to look all the way around them if we can. The problem's rebellion, isn't it? Why do you speak in parables? Because people choose to rebel. Why do we still have invitation songs? Because some people come to that point in their lives and they're ready to admit that they've been rebelling. If that's you tonight, I ask you to stop and I ask you to come while we stand and sing.